Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Richard Hayes, and I'm Deputy Chief Economist at the ONS, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to Session R on measuring welfare. I'm afraid I need to start with a short apology. Andrew Aitken, who is one of our scheduled speakers for today, is unwell and is unable to present. We're hoping that his slides will be available alongside all the others at the end of the conference. So if you are interested in his session, please do look for those slides. And I'm sure he won't mind people directing questions to him around the material. And we hope he gets well soon. Because we are missing Andrew, we're going to slightly reconfigure this session today. So Dorothy Hilrichs will speak first. She will speak for more like half an hour rather than the 20 minutes that you've heard in sessions elsewhere in this conference. We'll then take 10 minutes of questions or so. I'll then cover my paper in about the same time, about half an hour. That will give us another 10 minutes for questions. And then effectively, if you have more questions, we can take those, or we can finish 10 minutes early. If you're wondering why you can't see me, it's simply because of internet connections. We've identified that the internet connection isn't quite strong enough to do words and pictures. So we're going to focus on getting the slides and the pictures, the slides out for you. I believe Dorothy should be able to present with her camera on as well. Okay, so to begin, we will pass straight to Dorothy, who's going to talk to us about recovering within country inequality from trade data. Dorothy, over to you.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm going to share my screen. So I hope the slides are well readable now. Okay, so
yes, they're fine.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm happy to present here. This paper is called Recovering Within Country Inequality from Trade Data, and it's joint work with Gonzague van Norenberg, who's also at the Université Catholique de Louvain in Belgium. So the motivation for this paper is that inequality is clearly one of the challenges that we're facing basically across the world in as well developed economies as well as developing economies. So challenges are a little different. Clearly recently with the COVID-19 pandemic, also inequality has again come to the forefront, as you see here in some headlines that I copied from, for example, The Economist or also the New York Times. And the UN has stated as one of its key goals for development to reduce inequality, in particular in developing countries. To really address inequality and to understand it, the first step is to have data on inequality. Only if we have data, we can study the causes and the consequences of inequality, and we can inform policymakers about trends or other developments. And typically, where does income inequality data come from? So usually this data is, so I'm going to talk about inequality in terms of income inequality here, which inequality has clearly many dimensions, but here it will be about income inequality. And so commonly, income inequality data comes from survey data or from fiscal data. And the problem is that, especially in developing countries where you maybe have a large informal economy, fiscal data is not covering the whole economy. And survey data is quite costly, first of all, to collect. Second, surveys are, excuse me, surveys are usually designed for the different country contexts. So this leads, for example, to the effect that we have for Latin America, typically data on income inequality, whereas for many African or Asian countries, we have data on consumption inequality. So, and if you don't want to kind of compare apples with oranges, there's a problem. So because of these challenges, for a number of countries and years, inequality data is not really available, or we have this issue of comparability. So to illustrate this point, I show you a map of the availability of net income inequality data for the time period that will be our sample, 1995 to 2018, so more than 20 years. And I extract this data from the World Income Inequality Database, which itself is a collection of many different data sources. And you see that in terms of net income inequality, Europe and North America is well covered, Latin America is still well covered, but many countries in Africa and South Asia really lack data for many, many years. And this is really a picture that is across different data sources the case. So our contribution in this paper and this study is that we develop a methodology to back out inequality from trade data. And with this methodology, we get Gini estimates for 160 countries over this sample period, 1995 to 2018. And with this data, we hope then to pave the way to use it for cross-country studies and to track inequality. Before I explain to you the methodology, why trade data? So what's the advantage here compared to the standard data sources? The first advantage is that trade data really has a global coverage. So all the countries record their import and export flows. And in addition, it's not only every single country, but we always have double recording. So each exporter or each country that exports records the product flow, and the country that imports also records that product flow. So we can increase the reliability of our data by comparing these both reports from the exporter side and then from the importer side. Also, this trade data is collected with a regular frequency. So we have data basically every year, whereas, for example, surveys maybe are only conducted every 10 years in the worst case, or just when it's like convenient for politicians, maybe even. On top of this, the advantage of using trade data is that we can guide our methodology with economic theory. There is a large literature on international trade and how trade flows basically are determined. And we can build on that economic theory to develop a method to recover inequality data to fill those gaps that I showed you in the map before. And now getting a bit more into the method that we're using. Basically, the idea is that what the international trade literature has shown is that as income increases, or not only the trade literature, but it's also in the trade literature, as income increases, expenditure on different products changes disproportionately. So if my income doubles, maybe I double my expenditure on, or more than double my expenditure on wine, for example, or on other type of products, some jewelry, or and for other products, maybe just basic food like pasta, I just keep the consumption equal, or the expenditure at least. So the income distribution, because of these disproportional changes, the income distribution of countries affects who is trading with whom, so which countries are trading with each other. And in our paper, we exploit this link in the opposite direction, meaning that by observing trade patterns and analyzing trade patterns, we can learn about the income distribution, the Gini coefficient of a country. Our contribution is then to fill the map. And here I show you our estimates for the last sample period. We're going to use 3-year time periods. 2016 until 2018 is our last period in the sample. And you can see that we can fill many, many blanks. Some are remaining, not because of our methodology, but because other data is missing that we would need for those countries. So, for example, we don't have GDP per capita data in Cuba or North Korea, Somalia, Yemen. But overall, we have like a much broader coverage than any of the established data sets, basically. Just one slide on the literature. So we're not the first to try to extend inequality data sets. We're also not the first to exploit this link between expenditure and income. And as I mentioned, we're building on a large literature in international trade that shows that the income distribution affects trade flows, and many different approaches that try to model this effect of expenditure on trade flows and income on expenditure. So the setting of our methodology is basically such that we think that countries produce different varieties of goods. So, for example, I already used the example of wine. You can think that French wine and Italian wine and Greek wine are all different quality levels or just varieties of wine. And so if I maybe have some starting level of income, I consume more Greek wine, and then as I grow richer, I switch to Italian and then maybe to some luxury French wine. Similarly for cars, maybe you have German cars, you have British cars, you have Korean cars, and these are all different varieties of cars. And as I already mentioned, so the household and any consumer that spends on these different varieties will decide how much he spends or she spends depending on how much it costs, but also depending on the income. But then moving from the consumer to the country and moving from the expenditure of one person to imports of the country, we just have to realize that imports are just the sum of the expenditure of all households on these different product varieties, on the French wine and the Greek wine, etc. And then we show in the paper with some algebra that we can decompose approximately imports, at least, into a component that is the spending at the average income. So if all consumers had the same income and there was no inequality, and then we have to add a correction term for inequality, which is basically a function of the Gini coefficient and a curvature parameter, that is how sensitive is the spending on the French wine as income increases. So to illustrate this logic a little bit, suppose we start at a level where everyone has average income, and then we import as a country 4 bottles of wine, let's say. But now we start redistributing income and create some inequality. So we create a group that is rich and we create a group that is poor. The rich will start importing just by themselves 4 bottles of wine, and the poor will only consume 1 bottle of wine. In total, this makes 5 bottles of wine. And the deviation between the average, the spending on wine at the average income, and the spending when we have inequality, this is what we exploit to learn about inequality. And this is due to this curvature by how much does the wine expenditure increase or change as income rises. So our method has 2 key steps, because crucial is to know this change in the expenditure as income grows. So in our first step, we will classify all the different varieties, so all the different wine varieties, all the different car varieties, and any consumption good that is traded, always by this product country pair. We will classify all these varieties by exactly how much does the expenditure change as income and inequality increase. And this is conditional. Here we use the trade theory. This is conditional really on other trade determinants, such as the bilateral distance or the size of the economies. And we do this using the subsample of countries that I showed you in the very first map, and that was in blue, no, in green. And the subsample of countries for which we have inequality data. So using the imports from let's say for each, for the French wine, we see to which countries does France export wine, how unequal are they, and based on this variation, we give French wine a certain income elasticity or an inequality elasticity. And we do the same for each and every product exported pair. And then in the second step, we recover the inequality. This is sort of the main step. So here we analyze imports. Now we're no longer looking at the country that is exporting the products, but we're looking at, let's say, how much is Brazil importing of French wine, how much is it importing of Greek wine, and then we compare the actual imports to what it would import if there was no inequality. And then the discrepancy between these 2 points is exactly this discrepancy between the 2 lines that I showed you in this little example. And this will give us the inequality estimate. So to summarize the theory, we have a couple of key assumptions, and this is the advantage really of using theory, that we can really highlight the assumptions and also, if needed, modify the assumptions. So the first assumption is really that there is this nonlinear disproportionate effect of income on expenditure. The second is because we use first a subsample of countries and then apply this classification to all other countries for which we didn't have inequality data before, we need to assume that at least the ranking of all the different wine varieties and all the different car varieties is the same across countries. And critical is also that imports provide sufficient information about the income distribution. So we need to assume that a person or everyone across the income distribution at some point will consume within those 3 years that we always look at, will consume some imported goods. And now let me use the remaining minutes to just briefly show you the data that we use and then the results that we get. So when I talk about trade data and we have product flows that we're using, an example of this, for example, watches, it's a fairly detailed description of the product. So we have in total 365 consumption products. We're using, as I mentioned, trade determinants that are common in the literature, and we use the Gini data from the World Income Inequality Database in the first step to classify all these varieties. So we have this time period, and in total we have more than 6,000 varieties that we can use then that we have to classify at first, and then where we use the imports of those different varieties to recover inequality. And so in total we will get more than 160 inequality estimates, or inequality estimates for more than 160 countries, by which we extend the data with 100 countries per period almost. So the results. So this map I already showed you. We fill really many blanks, except for a few countries that have some other data constraints. You can ask how reliable are our estimates. And indeed, what we do is an exercise that we change the set of products that a country is importing and see how, if we, for example, remove all the wine imports from the Brazilian import basket, how sensitive is the inequality estimate to removing wine and removing cars and removing all other products, any kind of combination of other products. And we see that for most cases, the estimates are fairly stable. So we remove, these are approximately 100 estimates out of 1,200 estimates that we have to remove because they are too unstable and too dependent on the exact set of products that a country is importing. But for the majority, so still more than 1,000 points for these country and time periods, we get very stable estimates with our methodology. And so now we can learn new things. We can make new comparisons across world regions that previously had data or not, but previously had mostly data that was not comparable. So that had, for example, consumption or only income inequality data. And what we see is that we have kind of these three groups. So on the bottom, the least unequal is Europe and Central Asia. And we have this middle group of the North America, East Asia Pacific, the MENA region that really saw this increase in inequality also prior to the Arab Spring in 2010. And this was a trend that was not observed in the standard data sources, or that was also not observed because there was just no consistent and persistent data available. And what we also see is that in this time period where particularly India was growing very strongly, South Asia, the inequality in South Asia, and this is the population weighted average inequality here, has been growing really strongly, so that now, according to our estimates, South Asia emerges as the most unequal region. In Latin America, the inequality has decreased due to also many public policies, such as, for example, the Bolsa Familia in Brazil. So once again, you might say, okay, that's all nice, but can I really trust these estimates? So of course, we will do a lot of validation exercises. So the first one is a procedure where we once again check how sensitive our estimates are to the exact sample that we use to classify products and to estimate the inequality. So this is called a 10-fold cross-validation exercise, where we randomly omit certain countries from the first step sample, where we classify the wines and the cars and everything. And on average, or the median, the deviation between our estimate and the estimate from the World Income Inequality, not the estimate, the survey data from the World Income Inequality database is 4.5 points, and in terms of changes between two periods is close to 2 points. What does this mean? Is this large or is this small? So to qualify these numbers, we think it's useful to compare for several countries really across the different data sources that we have, because for some countries we really have a lot of different data sources. And so what I show you here is our estimates are always in red. Then we compare this to the World Income Inequality database, which collects different surveys, which is in blue and dashed. Then we compare this to the Luxembourg Income Study in green dashed, the World Bank data in yellow and solid with triangles, and finally the World Inequality database, which combines survey and tax data. And so you see, first of all, for these three countries that I show you as examples, Denmark, US, and Britain, even among the established data sets, there is quite a large variety in terms of levels, quite large discrepancies. And what you see second is that our estimates are not very far off. In particular here in Denmark, where the fiscal data is quite detailed, or also survey data is really of high quality, we see that our estimates are, particularly in the trend, quite close to the data from the World Inequality data set that uses fiscal data and survey data. Similarly, for the US, we show that there is much higher inequality than what is predicted from the survey data, and in line with combining this survey with fiscal data. For Britain, we deviate here in the beginning much more from the other data sets, but in the last 10 years of the sample, we're once again really close, and so we think this is really good evidence that our estimates can really do a good job to extract inequality from data from the trade data and use this methodology then in particular for countries that lack the resources to really monitor with surveys the income distribution, so particularly in developing countries. So the time is almost running up, but so on average, basically, or in the median, we always deviate between 4 and 5 points from the other data sets that are sort of established but have much smaller coverage than what we have. So we do a bunch of robustness checks, mostly to vary the economic theory that underlies our methodology. I won't go into the details here, but if you're interested, I'm happy to share the paper, and will soon be available also on our webpage. And I will sum up here. So we have developed a methodology to infer inequality from import data using this two-step procedure that is based on economic theory, and that consists of these two major steps, where in the first step we estimate preference parameters, and these classify varieties, so product exporter pairs, using a subsample of countries for which we have inequality data. And then in the second step, we compare how much does a country import vis-a-vis how much would it import if there was no inequality. And this discrepancy, given the parameters from the first stage, we can link to inequality. And using this methodology, we can consistently estimate inequality for 160 countries for over 24 years. And potentially this can always be extended the more the trade data becomes available. So I'm happy to take your questions, and I'm also happy to share the data soon, such that it can be used and can be explored. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dorothy. We are now open for questions. Just to inform those who've joined the session slightly later than my opening remarks, Andrew Aitken, who was scheduled to give the first talk, is unfortunately unwell. So Dorothy has moved forward, and we'll be making Andrew's slides available. Just while we wait for some questions to come in, I was going to ask one around, you had a small, I think you said around 100 countries that 100 data items that you excluded because they gave some rather rouge results. Were there any clear trends in which sort of countries or which sort of time periods those data were falling?
I think it's mostly countries that don't trade so much. So it's we do need to have some variation in the trade flows, and indeed I can go back to that figure. So this is, for example, Bhutan here is really standing out. Laos a couple of times, Timor-Leste. So also, well, Iraq, the Palestinian region. So these are to some extent countries that just don't trade much, and therefore lack some data and some variation. And that's what I would say.
Okay, so we're open for questions. If anyone would like to ask a question, there's a box at the bottom of the screen. Please type your questions there. Just whilst we're giving people an opportunity to do that, in terms of your results, which countries gave the most surprising results compared to the published data? You showed us the UK, the US, which had some interesting patterns, but were there any countries that were surprising for you?
So I think it was a bit the other way around. So there are some countries where we find, in particular in Latin America, for example, for Chile, we find inequality levels that are about 8 points higher than what the survey data, for example, captures. And so I was kind of more confident with our data, also given the recent protests that we've seen in Chile, that there was really this perception of inequality as a severe societal problem there. And this is something that apparently the survey data did not so much capture, whereas our methodology there performed better, let's say. And other countries that I could mention, so yeah, many in Latin America, because there we have the comparison point. But maybe if I go back to the map for the last for the last period. So what I find also surprising is that we do have this variation on the African continent, and that yeah, for example, here in the MENA region, it's also not, it's kind of in the mid-range of inequality. But we can basically, in the methodology, the way I explain it now and the way our baseline methodology works is that we really treat all the countries in exactly the same way, which is kind of the point as well to increase this reliability of our estimate and the comparability, indeed, the comparability of our estimates. But we could put more weight on certain products. And we have an exercise that shows that if we restrict, for example, to products that are likely to be consumed, particularly by the very poor and the very rich, so that have a very wide span of varieties, our estimates kind of change a little bit, such that under some circumstances, the MENA region then becomes more unequal, or the trend, the increase in inequality in the MENA region, for example, is stronger. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I don't think we've had any questions in yet. If anyone wants to take a final chance to ask a question, now's your opportunity. If not, if you're happy to stop sharing, Dorothy, I will put up my slides. Which I hope you can see.
Yes.
Fabulous. Dorothy, I can't see the chat anymore, so if you can shout out when I have 5 minutes left, that'd be fabulous. So I'm going to begin and welcome. So this is some work that my team at the ONS has been undertaking for the last few years. The views expressed to those of the authors, not necessarily of the ONS, as normal. And so I want to sort of start with some of the background around this. And I put down here the sort of the particular background of how we've sort of reached this point. But I think Paul Schreier actually laid this out far better than I have here yesterday. In essence, as Paul outlined, since the 1950s, there have been theoretical discussions in this area of GDP, welfare, economic welfare. What are we attempting to measure? How are we attempting to measure it? And various great minds have fought considerable thoughts in this territory, whether that is the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi or other groups further back. There's been a long-running discussion about how and where we attempt to measure welfare and how well does GDP kind of play into this space. This work, we put forward a paper in 2019, Josh, Walter and I, which laid out some of the theory. I'm not going to run through an awful lot of the theory. I will give you some in this talk, but if you want to see more of that, that's available in that paper, which is available on the ESCoE website. This paper talks through more empirical estimates and effectively is the point where we've been able to take this theoretical work and in the UK context use mainly pre-existing data sources to provide some estimates and ask some key questions about those estimates themselves, what they tell us about welfare relative to GDP, and allows us to ask some questions about whether those new data would be useful for policymakers, and indeed whether GDP acts as a strong proxy for those measures. And I'd like to particularly thank Rob, Rob and Cleanna, who are on this call, and Stephen, who couldn't join us today, who've done much of the legwork in this area. There are a couple of methods developments that we have put into these empirical estimates. I'm going to talk through one of those around public sector in more detail. We also have one around thinking about the atmosphere, which I will talk about briefly. But if anyone wants more detail on that, Cleanna is definitely the right person to talk to, who has led on that particular area. So let's get started. So what's so wrong with GDP? Why are we having this debate? And for me, really, I think this starts from a position where we need to go back to some fundamentals. And this top bit in italics is a quote from our paper in 2019, sorry. That all economic measures of prices and volumes are effectively a measure of economic welfare. The issue for us is whether they're very good ones. And this comes down to how accurately they map to some concept of economic welfare. And I'm going to come to the concept that I'm going to be using in a moment. And the challenge here is effectively that GDP is often seen as not a very accurate measure of welfare because it's not a very complete measure. It doesn't include lots of things that one might want to talk about when one is thinking about economic welfare. And again, Paul Schreier's talk yesterday morning, where he outlined his way of thinking about it, is very close to what you're going to see in this paper, thinking about those three core types of assets: productive capital, human capital, natural capital, and thinking about that production process and the different places that it can occur. GDP is focused, I've given you a quote there from ESA 10, I could have quoted the SNA, but effectively GDP is a measure of the volume of output produced within recognized economic markets, basically at meaningful economic prices, or with some proxies in there. And clearly that is not all-inclusive. I'm going to take you through some more detail around why it's not all-inclusive in a moment. But I also want to make a fundamental point here that about the limits of our ambition. And in this piece of work, we do have a limited ambition. This is not attempting to say anything about well-being. This is not attempting to say anything that sort of would compete with something like the UN Sustainable Development Goals or other pluralistic dashboards of well-being measures. This is wholly and solely trying to capture an idea of the composite economic benefits which flow to individuals in a society, irrespective of whether they come from a recognized economic market or whether they come via alternative routes. And as I'll explain, we broadly picture this as a concept of income, of being able to translate those different types of benefit into measures of income that we can then aggregate and look at the complete value of the benefit or the complete income equivalent that consumers are receiving. So if we've got these this clear distinction between sort of GDP and welfare, where does this problem emerge from? And in part, it emerges from a lack of an alternative. If you don't have a better measure, you're going to use GDP because it has lots and lots of appealing qualities, and these shouldn't be really forgotten. You've got a long time series, you've got consistency, you've got comparability between countries. You can look back at previous historic events. If you want to know what's going to happen during a recession, if you want to make forecasts, GDP gives you examples from different types of recession. You can use that information to shape those forecasts. And because it is composed in the way that we build it, you can decompose into its components to understand where within the economy growth or a lack of growth may be coming from. All of these are really strong qualities, and in part they are a very high hurdle for any new measure to attempt to compete with. And so for us, one of the key questions that we had was not just producing a one-off one-year set of data, but to attempt to see how close we could get to producing a longer term time series, which would allow you to compete effectively with GDP. So I talked about what's missing from GDP, and I'm really going to effectively take us through three areas. The national accounts obviously include GDP. They cover all that economic activity within what we call the production boundary, i.e. those markets that we define are economically meaningful, which are captured within the national accounts. However, alongside this, there's two areas of the world which I'm going to pick up on, which we want to bring into this picture, which we think are really vital to understanding welfare and these flows of incomes which consumers can receive. The first is the household satellite account, which effectively picks up all the unpaid work which occurs in our economy, whether that be childcare, cooking, own transport services, DIY. There's an awful lot of activity and benefit that people get from this unpaid work activity that is excluded from the national accounts. And so this is an obvious first port of call when one's thinking about how to widen the scope of a measure to capture more of these streams of benefits. The second are the environmental satellite accounts. And this really gives you the flows of benefits which don't necessarily result from human intervention or a more limited human intervention, whether this is ecosystem services or as Paul was again talking about yesterday. It's a real joy being able to follow a day after Paul, because he's been able to contextualize an awful lot of the things I want to say in this talk and help us move through it more quickly. Now, I joined the ONS about 5 years ago, and the thing that sort of essentially caught my eye pretty quickly was that actually a lot of this data is available within the data sets that we already publish. And actually having the components, the question was really, how do you go on to exploit those components to tell a coherent and integrated story? And that therefore takes me to sort of the next part of the talk around what can we learn from GDP? So in a sense, again, what's GDP not doing for us? It's not capturing these flows of benefit from outside the market. As it's a gross measure, GDP doesn't capture depreciation of assets. And as Paul described, the importance of understanding the sustainability of our capital base is really key to a concept of welfare. Some of the natural assets have an international aspect, and obviously a domestic set of accounts may not necessarily give you the best picture of those, and I'll talk a little bit about how we try to address that later. And of course, we don't capture those assets which are beyond the productive boundary, so there's no place in GDP for natural capital or human capital. So if we want to deliver a welfare measure, we need to stand back and think, in essence, what can we learn from GDP? And I think this is where I'm going to draw a sort of distinction between two aspects of national accounts that I think are key to understand. The first is the national accounts give us a concept of scope. The bottom right-hand arrow here uses the technical phrase of the production boundary, but it's effectively, I'm going to leave the phrase production boundary to just refer to GDP, otherwise I and probably you are going to get confused. I'm going to use the phrase activity boundary to describe where the production boundary is now, or the activity which is caught in scope. As we flex that activity boundary will move and may no longer accord to the production boundary in the national accounts. But it also gives us this defined asset boundary that aligns to that activity boundary. But what it also really importantly gives us is that integrated stocks and flows method, where there is a place for everything and for everything a place. Although for some instances, as we've just described, that place may be outside the production boundary at the present point. So thinking about what we want to take from GDP, it's really that method of aggregating. I've given you here 4 pictures. On the left, we have a fairly homogeneous good, apples. Then we have a fairly heterogeneous good, cars. Cars come in lots and lots of different shapes and sizes. Then we have a free good, a free service, healthcare delivered via the NHS in the UK. And then we have paid for services, represented by the gym on the right. We have this method of aggregating very, very different things into what we consider to be one meaningful and economically significant measure, or a series of measures, GDP and the other aggregates that fall out of national accounts. But it's really that method of aggregating. And it's a method that's built on effectively consistency and symmetry between where you draw that production, that activity boundary, and where you draw the boundary around the assets that feed into the production of those goods and services. So quite often when you look at this space, voices will talk about the importance of picking up depletion of natural capital, or understanding the importance of unpaid work. What we attempt to do in the piece, in the analysis I'm about to show you, is to try and make sure that we try and move the activity and asset boundaries symmetrically. So if an asset is brought into consideration, so we want to capture its depreciation, we want to think about its depletion, we also capture the flows of benefits which arise from that asset, to try and make sure that we've not completely delivered all of the wiring in a complete national account sense, but there is the basic shape of what the symmetry delivers to make sure that we are consistent. And it's worth saying at this juncture, the work we've done here very much is there to pilot and to show what is empirically possible, because at the heart of this, we want to move away from a theoretical conversation into probing those empirical results and working out how to do them better. So very much there are gaps and holes, and I will talk about those. But it's very much, we want this to be the start of a debate and an opportunity for us to take and develop this forward. But we wanted to do it within the sort of this underlying core methodology of that underpins the national accounts, of making sure that there is a place for everything and for everything a place. So for those of you who've heard me talk on this subject before, you'll recognize this picture, and I'll be clear, we're going to only move up from current GDP round this spectrum to welfare minus in this talk. As I've said, we're not trying to substitute a welfare measure, a measure of economic welfare, for a measure of well-being. This is not going to be a measure of well-being, because you really cannot understand the complexity of human life and society in a single number. I think that's Paul Schreier picked up on this point yesterday, but I think it's one we fundamentally agree with. But we do believe it is possible to understand economic welfare, the sum of flows of benefits, in one number. Whether that is what I'm going to label an augmented gross domestic income, plus means it includes all these components, and I call it income because we're thinking about this in an income way rather than a production way. But we also want to show you basically an adjusted net national disposable income. The reason we call that minus is because there's a really important point here, that if you're trying to understand welfare, you have to understand distribution. And that welfare measure, that sort of second slice of pie on the right hand side, we haven't managed to achieve in these data, because what we've got is sort of overall national aggregates. We don't have that distributional picture. I'm going to come back to that, because as you're going to see from the results, that is a really important consideration if you're going to look to use these numbers for a policy purpose. So the technical bit, what have we contained, what have we not contained. So effectively, we're going to start on the left. We're going to build on. We're not rebuilding GDP here. I think that's really important to say, and I'll stress that again at the end. We have no desire to rebuild GDP. GDP is a really important and useful metric for all sorts of economic decision making. But there are other questions for which a measure of social welfare may be better applied. But we want that to build upon and be consistent with and coherent with GDP so that we can understand their differences, because it's the differences which are going to be so vital in anyone attempting to use this data. So where are those? So moving from GDP to augmented gross domestic income, what have we included? Okay, now in that last slide, there's effectively two slices of pie between current GDP and welfare minus, and there's a slice there called future GDP. We say that because GDP and the national accounts don't stand still. Periodically, every 10, 15 years, the manuals are revised and the methods change. And when the methods change, the data changes. And there is progression in this space. So some of these components are things which are more in the territory of things which you could easily see being included in the next or a future iteration of GDP. And so just for the UK context, I've put quality adjusted non-market GVA in the public sector, the non-market industries. So for those who saw the panel session on the first evening of the conference that Joe Grice chaired, we're going to go back and we're going to talk about that a little bit. But also, a number of you will have seen the ONS's publications about previously uncapitalized intellectual property products, so intangible capital. And the importance of these data is that when one goes to the Corrado, Holton and Sickle framework, not all of the capitals that they identified were ultimately incorporated into national accounts in SNA 08. But of course, that fundamental intellectual legwork has been done. So underneath the bonnet, we can see those as something which we could see integrated into a future GDP potentially in the future. In the middle, you have the household flows of benefits from unpaid work, and we're going to plug in the flow of benefits from carbon sequestration, acting as a subset of the environmental assets in the UK. One of the reasons that we haven't included all of the environmental assets or all the flows of benefits arising from the natural capitals is in part because we don't have necessarily the time series across the whole period that we've been able to look at for the rest of the material, and therefore we've been a bit cautious there. So there is more potential, and I think particularly when one looks at the Dasgupta review, that's an area where that potential we do need to continue to exploit. The ONS is world leading in this space, but I would strongly recommend people do look at that material because it is a area of growing focus that we're going to continue as a community to need to focus on.
A little less
on the right hand,
Richard.
10 minutes. Okay, well,
7.
Little less, 7. That's okay. So augmented national disposable income, I might run over by a minute or two, but we probably got some time for that. Right. Augmented net national disposable income plugs in all those things you'd expect: income from abroad, less transfers from abroad. But the important thing here is we're going to sweep up depreciation for assets which are outside the national accounts asset boundary. So durables in the household. So we're getting the benefits from them through that unpaid work. We're going to capture the value of these durables, whether that's white goods, cars, or computers. We're going to take off the depreciation of those uncapitalized intangibles, and we're going to look at what we can do around degradation of the atmosphere using some methods which have been proposed under the current negotiations to revise the SNA and to make sure we remain in line with the SEEA. So we get to the fun bit, we get to the results. And so I'm going to start by taking you through one of those key changes, one of those developments that we've put in place, and this is around public service quality adjustment. So just to contextualize, there are effectively 3 measures, 3 ways of thinking about the public sector. as Phil Wells outlined in the panel session on the first day. You can effectively treat this as a service which is valued at the cost of the inputs which go into it, so inputs equals outputs. You can look at the number of outputs and find some way of directly measuring them, such as the number of operations carried out by the health service, or you can think about quality and the quality of the outcomes which those services deliver. Now, in the UK, under the manuals that we currently operate with, the blue line there represents a measure based on a direct measure of output. So number of children in school, number of operations carried out in hospitals, number of people in prison, et cetera, across the range of the government sector. And that covers about 20% of the economy. We also undertake work to try and understand and develop quality adjustments for these services. And at the moment, we cover around 60% of the government sector, of the public service sector, with quality adjustments. Now, I'm going to work on the assumption that the 40% we haven't modelled is effectively well proxied by the average of the 60% that we have. And if you apply that factor, you get something that looks like the orange line, which gives you faster growth throughout this time period from 97 through to 2017. Now, we're actually going to plug that orange line into our data. And why are we doing this? Why do we think this is important? A very simple pen picture. Imagine you have 10 operations costing about £10 each. And the next year, your model changes. You're going to deliver 20 operations costing £5 each. Twice as many, half the cost. Inputs equals outputs, no change. If you're just measuring the number of operations, you've doubled output. You've added 100%. But what if this operation now leaves people in considerable pain for the rest of their life? This is what we mean by outcome measurement. How much would we as consumers pay on the market for a product? If I offered you an apple and said this product will give you considerable pain for the rest of your life, I'm going to operate on an assumption that your willingness to pay for this product is going to probably be somewhere in the region of £0. It might well be negative. So if we were to now look at this operation that is now causing people considerable pain and operate on the assumption that no one would willingly pay for it, anything more than zero, you're in a position where you look across these three metrics: inputs equals outputs, no change; number of operations plus 100%. If you're valuing this at zero, in the same way that you might, if a factory was delivering broken bricks, the market price of those broken bricks, irrespective of the inputs, is zero. So output is zero, so you'd have minus 100%. And so, that's a trite example. But if as economists you believe there's there's any sort of cost quality trade-off which is normally revealed through the price, it is fundamentally important to understand how that quality change is reflected in non-market activity. And obviously here you can see it's quite significant. What we've here is a 20-year period which has added us 10 index points over this time period to this metric. So that's quite considerable, and therefore, as something which is under consideration in the different manuals, some of the manuals that we use will permit this, some will not. We thought it was important to contain, and as that's an innovation, we've spelled it out to you. But that's not really what you're here for. You want to know what the total empiric numbers look like. So here's a snapshot just for 2016 of our augmented net national disposable income measure, which shows you how we would add various measures together. So you can see there the very significant difference between the second grey bar, GDP, and the third grey bar from the left, gross disposable income, our new measure which captures household unpaid work, intangible investment, carbon sequestration. Importantly, because this is in current prices, we only quality adjust the volume measure of public services. So you're not going to see anything for public services yet, but we're going to get there. So you can see that GDI is significantly higher than GDP. We're comparing 2 trillions with somewhere around 3.3 trillions. Then you continue to move to the right, you have the red bars which show the various types of capital depreciation, and we can see that from the data we have, productive capital within the national accounts still covers the vast majority of depreciation that we see. We see some very small numbers for climate degradation. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And we see our old friends' income and transfers from abroad, which means that we end up with an NNDI minus number of somewhere around 2.7 trillion pounds. And again, you can see the significance of the difference there from that 3.3 trillion that we had in GDI. But a snapshot in current prices is only so useful. The big question which underlies all of this discussion is, are we producing some new numbers which are policy relevant? Are they going to help anybody? Or is GDP a good proxy for what we've got? Because if it is a good proxy for particularly growth rates of GDI or NNDI minus, then one might be relatively relaxed with policymakers using it simply because, quite often we do think in growth rates, and it's the growth rates that matter. So let's have a look at some CVM growth rates. And so what you've got here, you have GDP, traditional GDP that you'll find in the blue book in the darker orange bar. Market sector GVA is in yellow, but you can probably ignore that for now. Blue book NNDI is the dark blue bar, and the grey bar is augmented NNDI minus. So it's that number that we've just generated. And effectively, you can see very clearly that we've got something happening. And what we've got happening is perhaps a story of two halves. If we'd started these data series in 2010, we'd probably be saying to you right now, well, it looks to us that comparing 2010 through to 2016, the growth rates are basically the same. GDP is a pretty good proxy for the growth rates of NNDI, so not much to see here. The issue we've got is in 2008 to 9, where NNDI minus, we see that recession is far more muted. It definitely doesn't look like the worst recession since the war at that point in time. Whereas if you look at the GDP or the market sector GVA or the Blue Book NNDI numbers, you most definitely get that impression. So the question is, as I said before, how do you decompose this? How do you understand where that difference opens up in 2008-9? Which takes us to this picture. Thank you. So here we can see, I think, essentially three stories. The first is very clearly that unpaid work. People have, in 2008-9, delivered a rapid expansion in household unpaid work, which we continue to see growing throughout this chart. In some ways, it's the stickiness of that unpaid work. It's not as if we've got a period here where people are made unemployed, do more services for themselves, and then return to paid employment. We see them continuing to devote time and effort into the production of unpaid work. Or at least we see the value of that unpaid work going up. Now, that, I think, takes us to a really key question about distribution. So let's take a classic unpaid household service like childcare. If this growth is coming from grandparents who are living on a comfortable pension, who are using this as the opportunity to go to the beach, the museum, the petting zoo, and have quality time with their grandchildren, then in distributional terms, in sort of well-being terms, that's a very different story to if this is a single mum in a small inner city flat with a screaming 2-year-old who can't access work which enables them to pay for childcare. Those are radically different stories. So looking at being able to get a view of the distribution of that unpaid work, I think that tells us that is a first order importance question to understand what's happening in there and where that is coming from. The second key point is basically, as Richard Blundell was pointing out in his talk on the morning of the first day of this conference, he was talking about relatively low wage growth. Well, if we look at those market and non-market GVA sectors, the light blue and the orange bars nearest the axis, you can see relatively low growth here in these sectors that deliver salaries. If you are reliant on a wage, particularly if you don't have a university degree, as Richard showed us, and therefore wage growth is low, if you also pick up the data that we published that shows that the relative share of hours worked by those without a university degree is falling relative to the share of those with university degrees, then you can see this is telling us something really rather vital about the distribution here, and the key importance of understanding this split between paid and unpaid activity. I'm also going to pick up a point here about the environment, which is, you can probably tell from the very small negative bars that we're showing here that in effect this is having a relatively small level of importance in this series, and this is where I mentioned triangulation earlier on. Does that feel right relative to the scale of the other factors that we've got in play here? And I think we'd dearly love to hear people's comments on the paper, which we hope to shortly publish via the ESCoE discussion paper series. Now, it's worth saying we've developed these methods using those being proposed around the SNA, and so we're looking here at damage to the UK atmosphere, and this includes effectively imports of damage, because this is the flow of benefits that UK citizens are receiving. It doesn't matter if the atmosphere is getting worse because we're producing carbon and sulfur, or whether that's coming from Germany or France or the States or China. It doesn't matter where it's coming from if it's causing a detriment to the climate and to the atmosphere. It's worth saying that within this work we produced an endogenous price of carbon. This actually aligns very closely to the published price of carbon that comes from DEFRA, which gives us some confidence, but I think does open us to questions about the relative pricing of carbon vis-a-vis the other components in this chart. So just to bring this together, I'm going to focus on this average on the right-hand side that shows that for the measures that we've been able to produce, relative to growth rates of around, say, 1.5% on average over this period for the measures that you will find in the Blue Book, we're averaging more at about 2%. And for those of us who think a lot about the productivity puzzle, this question of what to do with this unpaid work and these environmental factors are really important. Paul mentioned yesterday, if you are producing two outputs, one, goods and services, and two, reductions in pollution or reductions in other forms of environmental harm, and your labor and capital inputs are going to producing these, and over the last 20 years or so, your efforts to reduce your environmental impact have increased, your output may have stayed, your output of goods and services relative to your labor capital inputs may have remained relatively constant. But if you're now producing more of this environmental services effectively, which are not captured in GDP, then you might question whether you are underestimating productivity growth. And for those of us who spend a lot of time looking at productivity growth, I think this highlights that this is a really important question. Equally, where a lot of, as Cleanna Taylor in their paper yesterday was talking about the impact of free digital services on unpaid work, Google Maps, we've all seen work from Brynjolfsson and team about the valuation of things like Google Maps, but ultimately no one really consumes Google Maps as a final consumption good. They consume it as an input, as an intermediate consumption input into producing their own transport services. I don't use Google Maps for fun. I use it to keep me out of traffic jams in Chepstow and Newport. And that delivers a real benefit to me. And interestingly, some initial work we've done suggests that when we look at the value that people put on Google Maps when they're asked these questions in surveys, if one relates that to the increase in value that we see in the unpaid work account around the value of owned transport services, there does seem to be a lot of similarities. So there is a question in my mind of whether people are really telling us the value of Google Maps, or they're giving us the value of the time they're saving by not being in traffic jams. So, key conclusions. Is this new measure perfect? Definitely not. You'll have heard me absolutely not talk about human capital. That's because we don't yet have a full framework to understand stocks and flows. The UN ECE have published a human capital manual, which is very, very insightful and hugely helpful in thinking about how you create those capital stocks. But in terms of what you then do with compensation of employees, what you do with mixed income, there's a set of questions there that we still need to resolve. As I said, what is the impact of free digital services on household production? The production of free digital services is in GDP, but if they're being consumed as intermediate consumption in the household unpaid work account, we need to think about that. We need to fill out that set of natural capital services flows with longer time series if possible, and some of that may very well not be possible because the data is just not out there. Will these new measures replace GDP? I think absolutely not, and I would strongly oppose that. GDP has its place in the firmament. It is fundamental to economic decision making. GDI and NNDI minus or NNDI plus, they're complements. They're going to provide a richer picture of economic welfare, and they should be helpful for other policy questions. But they may not be so relevant for some of those questions that GDP is perfectly targeted for. And as I said before, we want to build upon rather than rebuild national accounts. What happens next? Hopefully quite a bit. As ever, this comes down to priorities and these sorts of things, but we're going to work to continue this development. We're going to look to update with the Blue Book 21 data set. We are working towards trying to tell a more complete story on our capital stocks by bringing together a publication that puts all of these on a common parlance so we can publish them and look at them together. And we would like to continue to develop to get to a point where we can do routine annual publication of these types of metrics. I said NNDI plus there, that's probably being a little bit ambitious for at least a 5 or 10 year window, but NNDI minus and GDI plus should both be metrics that we should stand a fighting chance of having a go at. And that very much is my talk. So looking forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Indeed, we have two questions. So we have a question from Noriaki Kinoshita and from Anna Galvao. Do I read them out? No, we can. I think Noriaki can be.
Hi. Can you
hello.
Hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi. Good afternoon. I'm participating in Washington D.C. I'm from IMF Statistics Department, Government Finance Division. My question is related to the use case of ANNID minus. Have you thought about the how you could use this indicator for policy making in general? Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we take both questions and then I'll try and pull together answers for both. Would that work best?
So I don't see Anna Galvao. Oh yeah, now I think Anna can talk.
Yeah, now I could unmute myself. So Richard, great talk. I'm just wondering the following. It looks to me that the household production was growing at faster rates than GDP. Is there a reason for that, or am I mistaken?
Okay, no, good question. Right. So let's take those together. So what's the use of NNDI minus in policy making? I think essentially here, the key benefit over and above, say, GDI or gross domestic income plus, as we've put it here, is really trying to capture this understanding about what's happening with depreciation and depletion of the capitals. It just so happens in the UK context that income and transfers from abroad in these years have been negative. But I think in essence, what we're seeing here is when we're thinking about sustainability and the future sustainability of our economy, we've recently had a review in the UK led by Partha Dasgupta from Cambridge University, who's been looking at the economics of biodiversity and has talked a lot about inclusive wealth and about sustainability. I think the Stern Review and other reviews over the years have focused on this. And really, I think the value that this gives us, as well as getting that full understanding of the flows of benefits, once you get to the LNDI minus stage, it gives you that context and that sight of actually what's happening with the stock of depletion and depreciation. And here you can see, you will be challenged to see because of our color palette, but the dark blue bar that you can pretty much mostly see that causes the growth from 2012 in terms of the total bar of the negatives is income and transfers from abroad. So you can see that depreciation is fairly static in total across the different capitals that we reviewed from 2006, growing up to 2011, but then you see a starker growth, a lot of which is coming from income and transfers from abroad from 2012 through to 2016. But you can still see underlying this that there is this story about increasing quantities of depreciation. And just in terms of that atmospheric degradation, now within that, interestingly, what we see is, I think, policy useful. So this is clearly, this is a period in time where the UK and many countries have been working to reduce carbon emissions. But degradation, once you've degraded the atmosphere, the more you put in, you're just degrading it further. And of course, we all know about marginal rates. That rate of degradation can accelerate. So even though the amount of carbon being added is falling, the cost of that has actually increased. And so throughout this period, even though carbon emissions have been falling, they've not been falling fast enough to fully compensate for the cost of the marginal unit of carbon. Now, I think that in policy terms is probably enough to sort of begin to point us in saying that getting proper good empirical estimates of these data, and I mean by that stronger measures than we've got here. This is very much a first time around the track. I think there's definitely a case there for saying, that we need to really focus on that as a society. I think I also, I have probably one of my areas of intrinsic nervousness about these numbers, and we very much published this under sort of a motto of, if you're completely happy with something by the time you published it, you probably published it too late. You've not given people a chance to get in early and give you sensible comments. We very much are publishing this with the hope that people will look at the paper and give us their thoughts on how to improve it. So Anna's question, unpaid work growing faster than the paid sector throughout this period. Yes, that's fundamentally what we're showing. And we're showing that when one is looking in welfare terms as to, obviously, the stock of these, you have to think about the stocks. And you can see here that market GVA is about 1.3 trillion, whereas the household production it's very hard to tell from here, but I think it's just over 1 trillion. It's not quite as large as market GVA, and obviously on top of that, household production is definitely smaller than GDP in levels terms, but it's definitely growing faster. And I think this again points us in the direction of some really interesting policy questions. And those policy questions are about who in society is having the time available to utilize to increase the value of unpaid work volume, the volume of unpaid work activity that we're seeing here. Where's that coming from? And effectively, in some ways, what's happening to productivity in the unpaid work sector? It's hard to think about productivity when you're not paying for the resources, for the inputs which are going in. But effectively, no one's been able to invent the 28-hour day. There's only 24 hours in the day. We know that the average number of hours worked has stayed relatively constant through this period. So either people are doing significantly less sleeping and leisure, or they're finding ways of being far more productive in the production of these unpaid services. And I think that in a period where we talk regularly, and we've talked regularly at this conference and at previous conferences about the UK's productivity performance, understanding, the value of services per hour worked in the unpaid work sector is clearly something that we should be giving some more attention to. So I think you're absolutely right, Anna, to focus on this area, because it is telling us something very different from our usual narrative. And that's really, I guess, the big takeaway for me, that when you look at these data, actually they are giving us sufficient insights, I think, to be worth looking at.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Thank you. Are there any more questions, Dorothy?
There is one question right now coming in from John Lawrence Pukis.
Hello, John.
Hi. Excellent talk. I really appreciate it. I just have a question. Were you able to generate per capita estimates, and how do they compare with GDP per capita estimates, if you have?
We haven't. It's definitely something we could do. Because the growth rate is faster and you're going to be dividing through by the same population, I assume it's that these measures will have faster growth than GDP per capita. But again, at that point, you probably do have to ask yourself some questions just on which per capita you should be thinking about, and whether you should be dividing GDP by the sort of working population and this measure by the whole population. I've not given that an awful lot of thought. Obviously per capita you would want anyway, but it's definitely something we can do, and it's definitely something we can add into the paper. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's see, at the moment, there's no question left, at least in the Q&A. So I would maybe have a question. Could you once again elaborate on how you actually measure those household production? So how do you put prices on something that is unpaid?
Okay, that's a very good question. So, and it's important to point out here that all of these data, apart from the quality adjusted public services metric that we've produced and the atmospheric degradation numbers, are all numbers which effectively we've drawn from other publications within ONS. So there's definitely a large fraction here is standing on the shoulders of some very significant giants. So if I don't do full justice to exactly how the team pulled together the unpaid work account, I hope they'll show me some mercy. But effectively, you have two fundamental methods that you can choose to apply. The first is you can look at the salary rate that individuals might receive from their paid employment, look at the time that they're investing into some of these services, and use that as a measure of the opportunity cost of how they produce these services, plus any value of any intermediate consumption goods that they consume to produce these. So if you buy food, that goes into your food services sort of thing. Or you can look at sort of replacement costs. So with the childcare example, you would look to the market and find the market price of paying someone to do childcare services for you. And we generally in the UK prefer this replacement approach, because if I was a highly paid brain surgeon doing childcare, that whilst there is that opportunity cost, I can't actually do brain surgery 24 hours a day. There comes a point where one has to stop, because one wouldn't be able to function as a brain surgeon anymore. Yeah, so one wouldn't be paid as a brain surgeon for those extra hours. If I substituted my 4 hours of childcare for 4 more hours of brain surgery, I wouldn't be doing, you know, an extra long shift of brain surgery. That wouldn't make any sense in the real world. So it's far better to price these services at this replacement cost of finding a childcare provider's annual average hourly wage and substituting that in for the price of what it would cost you to deliver these services.
I see. Thank you very much. That's clear.
Thank you.
So there hasn't been any additional question in the Q&A. Yeah, thanks for that very interesting talk. And I think that kind of concludes the session.
It does. So thank you all for attending. I hope people have found the 2 papers interesting. Both papers and Andrew's slides will be made available via the portal and then later on the ESCoE website. I do hope you stick around for the other sessions today. There's some really good stuff coming up later in the afternoon. But apart from that, I will wish you a very good weekend and hope that you have enjoyed the conference, and we will see you again next year. Thank you all.